Week 15 of the fantasy season is here. It is the first round of the fantasy playoffs, so you know what that means. We're going to go through every single matchup, break down every single running back, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in Week 15 of the fantasy season. All right, let's kick it off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Falcons traveling to face the Buccaneers, and this one should be pretty straightforward here. This is going to be a big game for the Buccaneers coming off of a loss this past week to the Saints, divisional opponent. So we're going to see a Buccaneers team come out here and try to put up as many points as possible, although that offense hasn't looked entirely inspiring as of late. Nonetheless, let's start with the Falcons side of things, who are essentially playing for nothing other than ruining a divisional opponent's hopes and dreams, which is also always a good thing. But Bijan Robinson coming off of a very unproductive day against the Seahawks, as the entire Falcons offense struggled this past week, just 9.4 fantasy points. But it's still Bijan Robinson. He still had 22 total touches compared to Tyler Allgeier's 13 total touches. And, 2 single-digit performances on the season so far. We're not going to hold this one against Bijan Robinson going into Week 15 here on the road against a Buccaneers defense that is still ranking in the bottom 12 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. So don't overthink it. I know it's the first round of the playoffs, so it's easy to do so. But if you own Bijan Robinson, still a must-start running back, no doubt about it in my mind. Then we look to the Buccaneers running backs. Bucky Irving also going to be just a must-start running back. 16.1 fantasy points in 2 straight games since returning from injury. A touchdown in each of those games as well. He had 17 total touches this past week, so still getting enough volume to feel good here. And it is worth noting that the Falcons' run defense has improved. Remember, we went through kind of that stretch where it was like, just start whoever plays the Falcons' run defense. But they have gotten better against the run and actually worse against the pass in the past couple weeks here. But they're still bottom 12 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. So this is still a good spot. Once again, the Bucs have a lot to play for in this matchup. It is worth noting that Rachaad White had 12 total touches this past week, and Sean Tucker got some volume, 7 touches and a touchdown for Sean Tucker. But this is still Bucky's backfield at the end of the day. Home game, big divisional matchup here. Bijan Robinson, Bucky Irving, still going to be must-start running backs here in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. And I'm keeping the faith in Bucky Irving here in Week 15. 2 games since he's returned from injury, 2 touchdowns. I think he gets another one against this Falcons defense. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog are getting a free NFL Pick Em to use towards Week 15 NFL action. Take that free Pick Em. Take Bucky to score a touchdown, and both of those lines hit. You're going to automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, as soon as you play through $5 on Underdog, they're going to give you $75 in bonus funds to use towards Week 15 NFL action, and a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So make sure you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH if you want to take advantage of all of their Week 15 exclusive NFL offers. All right, let's move into the early window on Sunday, starting with the Ravens traveling to face the Bengals, another big divisional matchup here, at least for the Ravens side of things. And once again, the Bengals looking to spoil a divisional opponent. Derrick Henry, solid in Week 14. No touchdowns, but did have 94 yards on the ground and 26 total touches. So we are still looking at double-digit performances for Derrick Henry in every game since Week 6 of the season, and in every game on the season except for 3. So Henry, while the ceiling hasn't been incredibly high, still a very good player in terms of a floor on a week-to-week basis. So the Ravens, coming off of that loss to the Steelers, are going to be looking to come out here and beat a divisional opponent. They are in must-win territory. I mean, they're on, the bubble here and everything in terms of the outside looking in to win that division, but they're still in the playoff picture right now. So they're not in the worst spot necessarily, but they're still going to be trying to do whatever they can to win this game against a Bengals team that is giving up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So this is a smash spot for Henry. He only had 17.4 fantasy points when these two teams met just 2 weeks ago, but still, you know what you're going to get here. It's going to be a good performance. Henry is a must-start running back. And then we move to Chase Brown, who for me continues to be a must-start running back as well. 18.5 fantasy points in Week 14 against the Buffalo Bills. 23 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown, but had 3 catches for 12 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown, and nearly had another touchdown in this game as well. So he's definitely getting the usage. He gets that volume in the passing game. Had 18.3 fantasy points just 2 weeks ago when these teams met. So Chase Brown has been on fire. He's been very efficient running the football for the most part. Wasn't very efficient this past week with 1.9 yards per carry, but it was a weird snow game, so let's try not hold it against him. And once again, he gets that volume in the passing game. He's, got back in the end zone this past week, which was something he hadn't done in a couple of weeks. Good spot here. I know the Ravens' run defense, once again, has improved, but they're still bottom 10 in fantasy points allowed to running backs. So Chase Brown, Derrick Henry, another big divisional matchup here where we are starting our studs no matter what. Moving along, we are going to have the Raiders traveling to face the Eagles. So let's start with the Raiders side of things. I'm just going to leave Ashton Jeanty as startable. Only 5.8 fantasy points in Week 14 against the Denver Broncos. 10 touches, 30 rushing yards, and then 2 receptions and 8 receiving yards. So actually 12 total touches. But nonetheless, just 3 yards per carry. The offense not very inspiring this past week. Geno Smith is banged up. Is he going to play this week? Is it going to be Kenny Pickett? Is it going to be Aiden O'Connell? Who in the world knows? What I do know is that I don't have a lot of faith in the Raiders offense this week going up against this Eagles defense, which this Eagles defense, I've pointed it out all season long, they do have their flaws, and they are bottom 10, technically speaking, in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. So ultimately here, I just think Jeanty could be in a situation where we see similar output to what we got this past week. Plus, they're on the road in Philly. If you guys own Jeanty, I would be looking to other options. And, man, he's going to get the Texans in Week 16. Should be fine at home against the Giants in Week 17. But remember, the Raiders playing for nothing. It feels like they're imploding. It's a bad spot for Jeanty this week. I would strongly suggest looking to other options on your team if you guys are Ashton Jeanty owners. But at the same time, he's getting all the volume here. There's really no other running back who's seeing volume, and he can always score. But even with this Eagles run defense not being their strongest suit, I still worry about this spot for Ashton Jeanty. All right, Saquon Barkley, I actually kind of feel the opposite. Now, as a reminder, I have to record these early on Monday before Monday Night Football has been played. So if my thoughts or opinions change here, there will be a pinned comment down below. And of course, if we see an injury to Barkley, there will be a pinned comment down below as well. But yeah, I think this is a good spot for Saquon Barkley. This Raiders run defense has really been struggling as of late. That they're actually decent early in the season, but now they're bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. We look over the last 2 weeks, they've been one of the worst defenses in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs, bottom 5, and they just got torched by RJ Harvey and the Broncos. So ultimately, I think Saquon Barkley is going to be in a spot, regardless of what happens in Week 14 against the Chargers, where he can come through here. And man, he's got such a good playoff schedule. The Raiders, the Commanders, the Bills, these are really good spots. I am just going to hold out faith here that Saquon Barkley is going to show up for us in the fantasy playoffs. I think it's going to start at home against a really bad Raiders run defense as of late. I think he's a start here in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. Moving along, we are going to have the Cardinals traveling to face the Texans. Let's start with the big question mark that is the Cardinals backfield. It's another week of, is Trey Benson alive? Is he going to play football this year? My thoughts, and I said it going into last week, my thought was that Trey Benson wasn't going to play in Week 14, and he didn't, right? And I don't really have a lot of faith that he's going to be out there here in Week 15 as well. So if he plays flexible, sure, but I'm kind of at a point where even if he plays, I'm like, what are we getting here? We don't really know. Like, it's been such a murky situation. So I don't know that I would put Trey Benson in my lineup with any confidence if he does play, especially against this Texans run defense and just this Texans defense in general. 9th fewest fantasy points for running back. So Actually, the weaker part of this defense is against the running back position, and they're still top 10 in terms of fantasy points to running backs. So if it's Bam Knight as the lead running back, I kind of talked about it going into week 14 as well. Like, he's playing the Rams. I don't really love this. So these guys could always score. Very, very low ceiling here. Desperation flex type running backs if you guys are desperate. And I wouldn't even feel very good about it if that were the case, to be honest. I would probably be looking elsewhere, just being that they're playing the Texans defense, right? All right, Woody Marks showed up this past week, 15.6 fantasy points, had that receiving touchdown, 68 yards on the ground. And this has really been the case with Woody Marks over the past couple of weeks. It's like he's getting the usage. He's been solid. But if he doesn't score a touchdown, you're not going to feel great. So I have to put him in the flex area. Now, it does help that Nick Chubb is a little bit banged up, dealing with that rib injury that he suffered. But we did see Dare Ogunbowale come in, and actually in relief of Woody Marks, because Woody Marks also got banged up. And if you guys were watching that game, I mean, it was a hard-hitting game. And it felt like Woody Marks was actually playing through injury. So I think that's something to pay attention to. But yeah, Dare came in, got that goal line, touchdown, vultured it. Probably lost Woody Marks owners out there matchups and maybe even fantasy playoff spots. But nonetheless here, I think he's a solid flex option. I'm a little hesitant to put him higher than that. But if Nick Chubb is out, then I think you got to feel pretty good about Woody Marks going into the week. So monitor the status of Nick Chubb if you are a Woody Marks owner. And yeah, I mean, the Cardinals have been really struggling against running backs. So maybe this ranking is a little bit unfair here. They've actually dropped to the bottom 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position with what the Rams did to them, with Blake Corum scoring twice and Kyren Williams scoring and just running all over them. So maybe it's a bit unfair. If Nick Chubb is not out there, then Woody Marks is probably a tier higher here. A home game for the Texans. They're humming right now. They're going to be able to play good defensive football. And at the end of the day, the Cardinals will find a way to stay in this game, I'm sure. So Woody Marks, a very strong flex, maybe even a little bit higher as the week progresses. Next up, we have the Chargers traveling to face the Chiefs. And as a reminder, I am recording this before Monday Night Football, so if there's any injuries, to the Chargers running backs, or my thoughts change here, there will be a pinned comment down below. But let's go ahead and start with the Chargers. Now, kind of the question mark that I will have is, obviously I haven't watched the Philly Chargers matchup here on Monday Night Football. So will Kamani Vidal still get some volume? Will they kind of ease Hampton in? That's up in the air for me, of course, while I'm recording this. But as long as Hampton looks like the lead back, I'm okay starting him against the Chiefs. I would maybe look to other options because this Chief run defense is still very strong. 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. They gave up that receiving touchdown on kind of a broken play to Woody Marks, but outside of that, they were pretty strong around the goal line this past week against the Texans. So, they've only given up 7 rushing touchdowns to opposing running backs on the season so far. So I think Hampton is a start, mainly based on the premise that this is a big game, a must-win game for the Chiefs, and still a game that the Chargers are basically looking at as a must-win situation as well to lock up a playoff spot or help lock up a playoff spot. So I think if you held Hampton this long, you're probably going to plan on starting him or potentially flexing him. So look to other options, but I still think Omarion Hampton, based on the volume that he should see, should be a strong start, although the matchup doesn't necessarily benefit him. Looking to the Chiefs side of things here, Kareem Hunt, I know he didn't really have a great game fantasy-wise, only 9 fantasy points, but he is still seeing the bulk of the volume, and he gets in on those short yardage situations, including the goal line situations at the end of the day. He is the red zone threat in terms of the running back position for the Chiefs. So I still like him this week as well. Chargers 14th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs. An okay spot here, but once again, I'm expecting points in this matchup. Actually, it's a must-win situation for the Chiefs, like I said, and then still, I don't want to say a must-win situation for the Chargers, but a win that they definitely want. So I'm going to go ahead and bank on both these running backs, but I do think they're kind of lower-end guys because the matchup is not great here, but we'll see how it shakes out. They're both still very startable going into Week 15. All right, next up, another big divisional matchup. We have the Bills traveling to face the Patriots. Let's start with James Cook and the Buffalo Bills. Good enough performance this past week for James Cook, 80 yards on the ground, 2 catches for 31 receiving yards, but still frustrating because he had those 2 fumbles, one of which, was a fumble at the goal line that should have been a touchdown. So he's had 4 fumbles in the past 2 weeks. So I'm not going to overreact here or anything. It's not something that I'm super concerned about, but I guess worth paying attention to. And yeah, it's a tough matchup. This Patriots run defense, 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs on the season so far. We know this is a tough spot. And the last time these 2 teams met, Cook only had 4.9 fantasy points, in which was a pretty low scoring affair. But, technically speaking, the Bills can still win this division, but they would have to win this game, and then they would have to have some other things go in their favor, including a lot of losses from the Patriots. So this is going to be a game where the Bills are going to come out here and do whatever they can to win this game. So come on, it's James Cook. He's still a top 10 running back in full and half PPR, top 6 actually. So you're going to start James Cook no matter what. Then we move to the Patriots coming out of their bye week. The last time we saw them in action, they were just running it up and down and throwing the football up and down the field against the Giants. Trayvon Henderson had 11.6 fantasy points. He had 14 total touches. Ramondre Stevenson actually out-touched him, 15 total touches, and also had 11 fantasy points. 49% of snaps to Henderson, 58% of snaps to Stevenson. But it was one of those games where it was like the Giants were really bad against the run, wasn't super competitive, so it made sense for Stevenson to get more carries. But yeah, Trayvon Henderson owners might be a little bit disappointed this week, but I still feel like he is the running back with the most upside here, and the Bills have still struggled against the run. They've improved slightly over the past couple weeks, but they're still bottom 10 against the running back position. So Henderson, still a solid start, maybe a capped ceiling to a degree here with Stevenson in the mix. And then once again, due to, the importance of this game and the matchup, I do think Ramondre Stevenson is at least flexible here in week 15. Moving along, we have the Jets traveling to face the Jaguars. Let's start with Breece Hall coming off of a bad performance, 4.3 fantasy points, 43 yards on the ground off of 14 touches, and that was it. Now, I'm going to leave him in the startable category because he's still seeing the primary volume here for the running back position for the Jets, but I would be looking, this is kind of similar to like Ashton Genty. I would look to other options this week if you have them, because I've been saying it for weeks and weeks. This Jaguars defense is nothing to sneeze at, and we know they are good against the running back position, 5th fewest fantasy points allowed. They've only allowed 842 rushing yards to opposing running backs on the season so far, which is actually the best in the league. That's ahead of the Patriots, ahead of the Broncos, ahead of the Lions. 5 total rushing touchdowns allowed. They're not so great in terms of receiving yardage, and they have allowed 3 receiving touchdowns to running backs. So at least there's that for Breece Hall, but I mean, he's only seen more than 2 targets once in the past 5 games. So, on top of all that, Tyrod Taylor banged up early. Justin Fields has a knee injury, didn't suit up this past week. Brady Cook might be the starting quarterback this week. Tyrod Taylor might be good to go, but I don't know. It just doesn't feel good this week for the Jets going up against this Jaguars defense that's humming. So Hall gets the volume. They are on the road here. Don't feel great about this one. I'd be looking to other options, but he is at least startable if you have nothing better. Then we move to Travis Etienne and the Jaguars. Encourage you guys to keep the faith in Etienne after a bad week and a good spot against the Titans in week 13. He came through against the Colts this past week. 2 rushing touchdowns, 74 yards on the ground, 1 reception, 8 receiving yards, 21.2 fantasy points, and you gotta like him against the Jets, who have now moved back to the 3rd most fantasy points allowed to running backs. Great spot here. They've given up 19 total touchdowns to running backs. Etienne's in a smash spot here. Jaguars sitting on top of the AFC South. They're going to be looking to get another victory here in Week 15. Bashal Tutin, questionable right now. Didn't do a whole lot this past week at all. He's not somebody that we can trust from a fantasy perspective, and kind of tough to even roster him unless you're looking to handcuff Travis Etienne. So, yeah, I think Etienne, a must-start running back here in Week 15. Breece Hall, I would consider other options as we get ready for the first round of the fantasy playoffs. Moving along, we have the Commanders traveling to face the Giants, another divisional matchup, but this one not so important. Let's start with the Commanders. Chris Rodriguez, 10 touches this past week. Was efficient, 5.2 yards per carry, but didn't do anything fantasy-wise, just 5.2 fantasy points, no touchdowns. Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt had 7 touches, and Jeremy McNichols had 1 catch off of 1 target, and that was it. Jaden Daniels set to miss some time here. I mean, I think technically he could be okay to play, but I don't think that they're going to play him. On top of that, Zach Ertz feared to have torn his ACL. There's still playmakers here, you know. There's good enough running backs in this committee, I guess. Terry McLaurin, Deebo Samuel still lurking around. Marcus Mariota has filled in nicely as the backup quarterback for the Commanders if we do see Jaden Daniels miss time. So I don't think all hope is lost here, but as a Commanders fan, I'm not very optimistic. But what we do know is that the Giants are awful against the run, second most fantasy points to opposing running backs on the season so far, 16 touchdowns allowed, and the second most rushing yards allowed of any team. So this is a good spot. Chris Rodriguez, a flex. I don't even want to call him startable, but he's flex worthy. Could get you like 10, 11 fantasy points if he does score. Now, we look to the Giants. We did not see them in action this past week as they were on their bye week. The last time we saw them in action was a tough matchup against that Patriots run defense. This is not a tough matchup against the Commanders, bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running back. So you got to feel good here. But kind of the issue is, we saw Tyrone Tracy get a little banged up, but it looks like, especially with the bye week in week 14, he's going to be able to play in week 15 is what the early reports are indicating. So both Tracy and Singletary will be startable. Singletary filled in very nicely in week 13, had 19.2 fantasy points. But, if they're kind of back to splitting the volume here, I mean, honestly, I kind of feel like they're closer to like a flex area. But since they have this matchup against the Commanders, I'll call them both startable, but you just have to understand that the ceiling will be capped here. One guy could end up with, a poorer day where the other guy benefits from scoring or getting more receptions, or maybe both of them are okay. We'll just have to kind of wait and see how things shake out here and if Tracy is good to go or not. But due to the matchup being at home, and I know that there's nothing to play for in this game for either team, but it's a divisional matchup. It's the NFC East. Both these teams are going to go out there and try and beat each other. And both the defenses suck, so we should see some points scored in this matchup here in Week 15. All right, next up we have the Browns traveling to face the Bears. So let's start with Quinshon Judkins and the Browns. Just 9.4 fantasy points this past week for Judkins, 26 yards on the ground, only 1.8 yards per carry. He's been pretty inefficient running the football really since like the month of September. But nonetheless, had 1 catch. It was a big catch, 58 receiving yards. So at least got you 9.4 fantasy points. But we've seen this offense over the past week open up a bit more, right? And actually be able to move the football by throwing the football, and Shedeur Sanders having a lot of success this past week. So ultimately here, I'm going to call Judkins startable because he's kind of in that area. Like if he doesn't score, you really don't feel good about his stat line. He doesn't really have a super high ceiling. And, a lot of people look at this Bears defense and just like, oh, this is a Bears defense. But, it's a good matchup in their head, but I mean, they're okay against the running back position. 15th fewest fantasy points allowed to running backs, kind of right there in the middle. So I wouldn't particularly say it's a great spot. And like I said, this offense is opening up a bit. They don't need to rely on Judkins as much. So I'm going to leave him as startable. I still like him this week. And in terms of like the startable players that I've listed today, who maybe I have some concerns about, I do like Judkins probably the best. But still, he is getting the volume and everything. But Dylan Sampson, 6 targets, 5 catches this past week, pretty involved in the passing volume, although he only had 2 touches on the ground. So that kind of hurts Judkins' overall potential for a higher ceiling, right? And then, this Bears team, I know they're coming off of a loss, but they just are one of these teams that I don't really feel confident going up against on a week-to-week basis outside of like the wide receiver position. So I like Judkins, but I do kind of worry going into this matchup. The Bears have a lot more to play for than the Browns in this matchup, and the Browns on the road here. We'll see how it shakes out. I still think Judkins is very startable, but I'm a little bit worried about his ceiling on the week. Then we move to the Bears running backs here, leaving them both as flexes, which is what we have had them as over the past couple weeks. And we know at the end of the day, they eat into each other's volume. 16 touches for Swift this past week, 15 for MIN-DAL. MIN-DAL on the field for 41% of snaps, Swift on the field for 57% of snaps. So not as electric as they were in week 13 against the Eagles, with Swift having 11.2 fantasy points and MIN-DAL 8.7 this past week. But we know that these two can always go off. It is a tough matchup this week against the Browns, but they've moved back a little bit against the running back position. 12th fewest fantasy points allowed to running backs, actually tied with the Colts for that mark, but that's better. I mean, they were ranking pretty consistently like in the top 6, top 5 for quite a few weeks. So that's good for the Bears running backs, but keep in mind this is still a tough Browns defense at the end of the day. So Swift, MIN-DAL, solid flex options. Judkins, still a good start, I think, but maybe have a couple concerns going into this matchup. All right, moving into the afternoon window, we have the Panthers traveling to face the Saints. Let's start with the Panthers coming out of their bye week. Rico Dowdle, Chuba Hubbard, the last time we saw them in action. Well, Chuba had the better day, 20.4 fantasy points. He had 19 total touches, scored that receiving touchdown. Rico still had 20 total touches. Rico on the field for 42% of snaps. Chuba actually on the field for 59% of snaps, and they did that against the Rams defense. So I don't know if this ranking is exactly fair. Maybe this is closer to like a Swift MIN-DAL type situation as the season unravels here. Maybe they should both be flex options, but we've still seen more consistency out of Rico Dowdle and his usage as of late. So I'm going to leave Dowdle as startable and Chuba as a flex option because I still think kind of a small sample size of Chuba getting back in the mix here, but it's not a great matchup, not a bad matchup. The Saints 18th overall against running backs, so it's good enough here. They're going to have extra time to rest, prepare for this matchup, and this is a big game. Saints trying to continue to play spoiler there in that division, but the Panthers still right there chasing the Bucs to potentially win this division. So this is a huge matchup, especially because the Panthers play the Bucs at home in week 16, then they travel in week 18 to play the Bucs. So the Panthers definitely want to win this game. It could be a potential tiebreaker. So I think both these guys are in play, good enough options, but once again, they're going to eat into each other's volume, so they're a little bit of lower ceiling plays potentially. Then we move to Devin Neal. I encourage a lot of you guys to roll with Devin Neal going into week 14, and he was solid, 15.4 fantasy points, 70 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown, a catch for 14 receiving yards. Nothing crazy, but you got to feel good here. The Panthers have dropped in their ranking against running backs. Do you think this defense is kind of quietly sneaky? But they do struggle against running backs, bottom 10 in fantasy points allowed to running backs. So if Devin Neal is going to get another 20 touches, you got to imagine at home he's going to be in the mix here for a solid flex option, or if you're really struggling, I mean, he can fill in at the RB2 spot for you guys. And Tyler Shuck has shown some life at the quarterback position over the past couple weeks. Now, this is all, bear in mind here, right? This is all assuming that Alvin Kamara is not going to play in week 15. So if he plays, I still think Neal's flexible, but obviously Alvin Kamara will eat into that volume to some degree here. But I don't know. The Saints really aren't playing for a playoff spot. We know that, and all of that. So I don't really know if Alvin Kamara is even going to come back this season. So I think Devin Neal very much in play either way. But if Kamara is out, he's a very solid flex option going into the week. All right, next up we will have the Lions traveling to face the Rams in a big overall game for both these teams. And it just feels like a big game anytime we see that, Stafford facing the Lions narrative, Goff facing the Rams narrative. But yeah, the Lions need to win football games right now to continue their playoff push, and the Rams fighting for the potential number 1 overall seed in the NFC. So this is a big game overall and two very good teams involved in this matchup. So let's start with Jahmyr Gibbs. It is a tough matchup on paper here against the Rams, giving up the 4th fewest fantasy points to running backs. But there is no way you are benching Jahmyr Gibbs in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. Single digits twice on the year, but I mean, he has a ceiling of 55.4 fantasy points, 37 fantasy points this past week, 3 touchdowns. Maybe this isn't his strongest game, but he's still as strong as possible as a start as you're going to get. So let's not waste any time. Gibbs in your lineup no matter what. And I think Montgomery is still a flex option here, assuming that this will be a higher scoring competitive game. And, you know, right when I started to give up on Monty for the year, will the Lions start using him again? 12.8 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games and a touchdown in 2 straight games. Now, if you take away the touchdown in each game, he hasn't done a whole lot. We did have 7 carries this past week, or 7 touches this past week, 10 touches the previous week. So there's enough volume that he has a potential to score, but I think he's a risky flex based on the matchup at the end of the day. So flexible, but don't go out of your way necessarily to start Monty. Then we move to the Rams. It's a tough matchup for them as well, as the Lions have technically given up the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs, and they're not as strong necessarily stopping the run. They have given up over 1,000 rushing yards to opposing running backs, and if we look at teams in the top 10, they've given up the 3rd most rushing yards in terms of teams in the top 10 with the fewest fantasy points allowed to running backs, but they're really good in terms of stopping receptions and receiving yards. They've given up the fewest receiving yards in that range of teams to opposing running backs and no receiving touchdowns to running backs. So I still actually think there is some life here for the Rams running backs, and I do think that they can come out of here with solid performances. Now, yeah, we're seeing a lot of Blake Corum involved, but I still think both these guys are very involved. I mean, Blake Corum was only on the field for 31% of snaps, and yeah, he had the better stat line. He scored 2 touchdowns. He had 128 yards on the ground. But still, they're using Blake Corum as these games progress and as they're blowing out teams. And the previous week, Corum got in the mix when Kyren was injured. I'm not saying that Corum's not involved. He's not getting early work, but sometimes the game script is really benefiting Blake Corum. And I think this past week, it really benefited him more than any other game. And Kyren still had 17.7 fantasy points, was still on the field for 51% of snaps, and he still scored a touchdown. So I still think Kyren Williams, who's the RB9 in full PPR, the RB8 in half PPR, is still a very solid start, as he's been all season long. He's only given you single digits twice on the season. So his floor is very safe. This is going to be a competitive game. I still like Kyren a lot this week, and I still think Blake Corum is flexible, but this game script may not benefit Blake Corum as much. So I would kind of temper your expectations here, because if you go out thinking that Corum's just, taking over this backfield and he's going to be the guy in week 15 and do what he did this past week, it might not happen in this game script or against this Lions run defense at the end of the day. So Corum, flexible. He has seen standalone value, but don't forget he had 8 or less touches in 3 straight games before this past week. So just bear in mind, I don't know if Blake Corum's season is necessarily going to blossom throughout the fantasy playoffs as they get the Lions. Then they're on the road against Seattle. Then maybe on the road against Atlanta. That'll be a good spot for Corum. But over the next 2 weeks, can't call him anything more than a flex as we move into the first round of the fantasy playoffs. Moving along, we have the Colts traveling to face the Seahawks. Let's start with Jonathan Taylor, the RB1 in half PPR, the RB2 in full PPR. Just 11.4 fantasy points this past week. Luckily, he did find the end zone, had 74 yards on the ground. But we know now, no Daniel Jones. Anthony Richardson is still on IR, so it's likely going to be Riley Leonard at quarterback this weekend. I mean, he wasn't good against Jacksonville, but we've seen worse backup quarterback play come in, and he's going to have extra time to extra time to prepare, practice with the first teamers this week. So maybe that helps, but against the Seattle Seahawks defense, I don't know if it's going to help very much. I'm feeling not so great about this offense, and the Seahawks have given up the 7th fewest fantasy points to running backs, only 4 rushing touchdowns allowed, only 916 rushing yards allowed on the season. So I'm calling Jonathan Taylor just startable. And I know some people are out there going to say, I got to start my stud player here in week 15, first round of the playoffs. I'm not going to overthink it, but you might want to overthink it. I am kind of worried about Jonathan Taylor, but the fact that he did score against Jacksonville and a very good run defense does give me some hope here. So he's still startable. It depends on who you guys have, but I still think he's very much in play going into the week. But yeah, I don't think this is going to be a high ceiling game. 11 to 15 points is what I'm looking at for Jonathan Taylor if he does score. I'm a little worried about that offense, to say the least. Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet, these guys are just risky flex options, and I've been calling them no more than flex options for weeks, and I got suckered into liking Kenneth Walker this past week, and 3.8 fantasy points, 11 touches for him, 8.6 for Charbonnet, 9 touches for him. And the problem really was that they didn't find the end zone, and they didn't need to. The defense was making plays, and the Seahawks just decided, we're going to open up the passing game and ignore running the football. And Sam Darnold threw 3 touchdowns. And, Shaheed had some big plays and special teams plays. And Cooper Kupp was involved. Jackson Smith and Jigba was dominating. So ultimately, they did not need to run the football, and it was a good spot. But nonetheless, with all the doom and gloom around the Colts, they are top 12 in terms of fantasy points allowed to running back. So it's kind of a tough matchup. Walker, Charbonnet, the most frustrating backfield in fantasy. They're just risky flexes here in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. Moving along, we have the Packers traveling to face the Broncos. Let's start with the Packers and Josh Jacobs, who had 17.2 fantasy points in Week 14, a touchdown, 86 yards on the ground. And Jacobs, in every game that he's played fully in this year, he has gotten you double-digit fantasy points, and he has scored a touchdown in every game this year he has played in full except for 2. So, yeah, you're still starting him against the Broncos, who have given up the second fewest fantasy points to running backs. And this game kind of has defense, low scoring written all over it. But it's Josh Jacobs. I am still rolling with him. He's a clear, RB1, gets the volume. We know what to expect here. You can't bench a guy like Josh Jacobs here in the first round of the fantasy playoffs, and the offense has looked good as of late as well. RJ Harvey, 22 fantasy points in Week 14 after having 21.2 in Week 13. Had a touchdown, had 6 catches off of 6 targets this past week, 25 receiving yards, 75 yards on the ground. He's getting the volume here, 20-plus touches this past week, 16 touches the week before. And, we see a little bit of Jaleel McLaughlin sprinkled in, and we're seeing, the kind of fullback there, Adam Prentice, get some touches, but nothing crazy. And then every now and then Tyler Bidet waddles in as well. But it is RJ Harvey's backfield at the end of the day, even if Sean Payton likes to involve a lot of different players at every position offensively. And it is a tough matchup as well. The Packers top 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs. And once again, this does have low scoring matchup written all over the place here. But I just think the running backs are going to come through in this matchup, and they have come through, obviously, on the season when they've been the starters on their team, So, Jacobs, Harvey, very much in play. Solid starts. You got to roll with them here in Week 15. All right, to finish up the afternoon slate, we will have the Titans traveling to face the 49ers. Let's start with Tony Pollard. Say his name, guys. We can't forget about this man. 28.1 fantasy points in Week 14. 161 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns against the Browns defense in a, cold, wet, snowy, ugly game. What are we going to do, Tony Pollard, this week? I'm not starting him. I'm sorry. I can't risk it, and maybe I'll regret this call. The Niners, coming out of their bye week, 17th against the running back position. They're not great. They're not bad. It's kind of okay, but I got to expect that Robert Saleh extra week to prepare for this game. He's going to have this defense ready. I just don't want to trust anyone on this Titans offense. In the first round of the fantasy playoffs, if you're desperate, sure. But I'm staying away from Tony Pollard. I'm staying away from Tajay Spears. I've been staying away for weeks and weeks and weeks. I'm not going to chase last week's points. I'm sorry. And maybe it's a bad call. Maybe it bites us. But, man, I'm not doing it. It feels way too risky for me. Let me know in the comments down below if you are a Tony Pollard owner, what you're going to do this week, and if you guys have faith in rolling with him this week or not. I certainly do not. Christian McCaffrey, I do have faith in. The Titans have improved against the running back position. They're actually out of the bottom 12, and they've been pretty good the past couple of weeks. But I still want to start Christian McCaffrey. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what the matchup is. There's not a lot to break down here. Double digits in every game this year except for one, which was against the Texans defense, right? He's the RB1 in full PPR, the RB3 in half PPR. 17.4 fantasy points the last time we saw him play against the Browns, which is still a tough matchup. And he has scored a touchdown in every game this year except for 4 games. So come on, it is Christian McCaffrey. We're starting him no matter what. Doesn't matter. We don't need to waste any more time on it. And I do not have enough confidence in Tony Pollard to consider him anything more than a sit here in Week 15. All right, Sunday Night Football, we're going to have the Vikings traveling to face the Cowboys. Let's start with Aaron Jones and Jordan Mason of the Vikings. A little bit of life in that Vikings offense at home this past week against the Commanders, so not a very good defense. But J.J. McCarthy, we got to hand it to him. He did play well this past week. No turnovers, 3 passing touchdowns, and the running backs were pretty good as well. Jordan Mason had the better fantasy day, 11.2 fantasy points, 52 yards on the ground off of 11 touches, and he found the end zone. But Aaron Jones was still very efficient running the football with 5.4 yards per carry, 14 total touches, 76 yards on the ground. So if he had scored, he would have had a nice day as well. But you got to still like the volume that he saw at the end of the day, and he out-touched Jordan Mason. So, yeah, a little bit of a split here. Jones, 45% of snaps, Mason, 30% of snaps. So, both these guys still involved, and it's a good matchup. The Cowboys have still mightily struggled against the running back position, 5th most fantasy points allowed to running backs. They've been bad against running backs all season long, so we know this is a good spot. They're risky. They eat into each other's volume, but you got to be kind of encouraged about what you saw this past week, and they will face the Giants in Week 16 in another really strong matchup before facing the Lions at home. So I think the Vikings players offensively are still in the mix here for the fantasy playoffs. And Jones, Mason, okay flexes, maybe a little bit touchdown dependent, but they're okay this week in a good matchup. Javonte Williams continues to be solid, 14.7 fantasy points, found the end zone this past week against the Lions. Gets the Vikings this week. I'm not sneezing at this defense. They're not bad. 11th fewest fantasy points to running backs, but they're not great at stopping the run. Over 1,300 rushing yards allowed, 10 rushing touchdowns allowed to running backs. So, they rank relatively high. They're really good at stopping, the receiving threat out of the running back position. Only 253 receiving yards and no receiving touchdowns allowed. And they're definitely better against opposing wide receivers and limiting quarterbacks than against the run, but they still rank very high against the run. So, not sneezing at this Vikings defense, but I still think this is a good spot for Javonte Williams and a must-win game for the Cowboys as they try to keep their playoff push and hopes and dreams alive, while the Vikings not really playing for anything other than trying to spoil the Cowboys here. So I do like Javonte Williams. Hard to bench this guy. Top 7 in both full and half PPR at the running back position. So he remains a strong start here in Week 15. All right, let's wrap it all up with Monday Night Football. We have the Dolphins traveling to face the Steelers. And we have a bit of a conundrum here with the Dolphins running back situation. Is Devon Achane going to play or not? Looks like the reports have indicated that he avoided a broken rib and has more than likely a bruised rib. Some sort of rib injury. We know that. It kept him out of that Week 14 matchup after he had only had 8 touches that went for 17.5 fantasy points, 92 rushing yards, and a touchdown. So he was on pace for a monster game before he had to exit. Now, what we do know is that this is a tough Steelers run defense. The rest of their defense not incredibly inspiring, but they've given up the 8th fewest fantasy points to running backs. But if Achane's able to play, I'm not benching him, not in the fantasy playoffs. And, man, the Dolphins have a strong strength of schedule here for the fantasy playoffs. A little bit tough this week, but then they get the Bengals and the Bucs. So if Achane is healthy, good to go. Don't forget the Dolphins' playoff push is still alive with another victory this past week. They are in the mix, and this is a big game for the Steelers, trying to stay atop of their division, get as many wins as possible, and obviously a very big game for the Dolphins. So if Achane's out there, which I think there will be a push for Achane to play, if he's out there, you got to start him. But I think if he does not play, then Jalen Wright, who had 24 touches, 107 rushing yards, and a touchdown this past week, is in the mix as a flex option. I don't want to call him more than that because he is going to be pulled off the waiver wire. He's only 5% rostered at the time I'm recording this, before waivers have pushed through for the week. And it's still a tough matchup here, so I'm going to call him a flex. And then Ollie Gordon could always get some volume too. I mean, he had 5 touches. He had a red zone touch, scored a touchdown this past week. So there's a possibility with, a new game plan here, if they're planning on no Achane, that we do see a little bit more Ollie Gordon than we saw this past week. You never know when these situations happen, although this past week it was all Jalen Wright. But Ollie Gordon is still a very talented running back as well. It is a tough matchup, but there's a lot on the line here. So I think to a degree, all the Dolphins running backs are involved, but I feel the best about A-Chain and Jalen Wright in that order based on what we've seen as of late. Then we move to the Steelers running backs. Jalen Warren this past week, 15.2 fantasy points, a receiving touchdown for him. Kenneth Gainwell, 16.2 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 catches, but had a rushing touchdown. 48% of snaps to Gainwell, 50 to Warren. So they eat into each other's volume. It's a committee backfield here, but they're both very much in play against the Dolphins, who aren't a bad run defense. I mean, they have really improved against the running back position, but they're still kind of right there in the middle, 16th overall, so it's a good enough matchup. But we look over the last 4 weeks, they've given up the second fewest fantasy points to running backs. We look over the last 2 weeks, seriously, the fewest fantasy points allowed to running backs. They've given up 62 rushing yards and 22 receiving yards. That's it over the last 2 weeks to the running back position. So, yeah, you can't really sneeze at this Dolphins run defense, and can't really sneeze at the Dolphins in general. I mean, this team overall, you got to hand it to them. I mean, they have really adjusted on the season, and they've definitely adjusted defensively. And yeah, the Steelers coming off of a big win, but man, the Steelers team is still really hard to trust. So this will be a really interesting matchup, a lot on the line for both these teams. So I think, there is the potential for points, even with there being tough, matchups for both sides, at least against running backs here. So I still think Jalen Warren, Kenneth Gainwell, very strong flex options going into week 15. There you guys have it. Every single matchup, every single running back, who you should be starting, who you should be sitting here in week 15 of the fantasy season. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comments down below. So whatever you guys need for the fantasy playoffs, please let me know. I'll be answering as many comments as I can throughout the course of the week. And while you guys are down there, helps out the channel tremendously. Does me a huge favor when you guys subscribe and hit that like button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, don't forget, guys, we'll have everything that you could possibly need here on the channel to dominate this week and every coming week for the fantasy playoffs. So make sure you guys go check out all of the content as the week progresses. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.